Good evening and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Friday Symposium. Today is Friday, September 26th, although we are pre-recording, which I do like to let you know, on the 25th, in the event that some major development occurs, as they are wont to do during this unbelievably turbulent period. That's why it has not been addressed. The UN General Assembly is occurring and heads of state are speaking. And I think one of the problems that we have, particularly in these so-called Western countries, which frankly are very uncivilized compared to those nations which are moving forward in space exploration, nuclear power, building modern cities, etc., is we are bombarded by so-called narratives. And the educational system has been destroyed so that people are very frustrated. They have a, in my opinion, very legitimate lack of trust in the governing institutions. After all, we still don't know really who killed President Kennedy or who orchestrated it. We don't know the truth about what happened behind 9/11, although we know that that event greatly changed the direction of the United States. So there is great reason that people do not have faith in governing institutions which appear to have failed to uphold the principle of the general welfare. So something Lyndon LaRouche considered very important is the question of method. How do you know that something is true? Or as Leibniz would say, why must it be so and not otherwise? Why is it this way and not otherwise? And this tradition of scientific research is really, frankly, exciting and optimistic, because what you discover if you embark on that path is we never know perfectly. We only know less imperfectly, but the insights that lead to that reduction of imperfections is very exciting. And as every great scientist found, you keep becoming completely blown away by the genius of the creation of the universe and the order and the intelligibility of it to the mind of man. So with that, I wanted to introduce my colleague, Roger Ham, whom I've known for many years and is a longtime associate and collaborator of LaRouche. And he is going to be talking about something he and his wife, Denise, worked on for many years, which is the work of the great scientist Louis Pasteur. So Roger, please go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. As you mentioned, my wife Denise was really the initiator of this research, and unfortunately she was feeling a little under the weather, wasn't able to be on this podcast, but played a major part in the work that we did on Pasteur. And we're going to talk about Pasteur and the whole history of vaccination. To put that in context, if you put up the first slide, this is a chart that was put together by Brian K. Long, which highlights some of the reasons why world population has grown exponentially up until this time. And while a lot of environmentalist zero growth people would yell and scream about how terrible this is, there was nothing inevitable about this, that the growth in human population has been the result of hard-won scientific and technological discoveries. And if you look at this, Mr. Long highlights some of the things: metalworking, the wheel, the creation of bronze and iron. And in the most recent period, over the last 500 to 1,000 years, you particularly have the development of more and more advanced forms of energy, which correspond to what Mr. LaRouche referred to as energy flux density, going from windmills to coal, the invention of the steam engine, electricity, oil and gas, fertilizer, that this is how the growth in population was actually brought about. And if you go to the next slide, this looks at average life expectancy just over the last 200 years or so. And you can see that in 1800, and I believe this was based on worldwide estimates, life expectancy was only about 30 years. And this highlights, I would think, the three major causes for a lack of the growth in life expectancy: famine, epidemic, and war. And if you look at the next slide, you can ignore all the little lines. That's just looking at different regions of the world. But going back to the 1700s, life expectancy was somewhere between 25 and 35 years. And probably the largest factor determining that was infant mortality. And you can see that there was a real shift in the mid 1800s when life expectancy began to rise rather rapidly. And the point I would like to make, obviously, this is the period when Louis Pasteur did his scientific work. He was born in 1822 and died in 1895. And he certainly wasn't the only person responsible for this, but he was one of the key figures in developing the whole idea of germ theory, that there were living organisms that were to blame for diseases in man and animals and plants, which could be identified and which could be combated. And that has been responsible for saving probably billions of children's lives over the last century and a half. And that is not guaranteed. That our current life expectancy, our current standard of living, our current state of healthcare is not guaranteed. Mr. LaRouche often talked about, in the event of a general economic and financial breakdown, that you could have biological holocausts, that you could have the return of old diseases as well as the outbreak of new ones, whether that's COVID, avian flu, or something we've never even heard of. And I want to discuss this more I guess, at the end of this program, but something that has been in the news recently has been the appointment of Robert Kennedy Jr. as head of the Department of Health and Human Services, and the, I would say, reckless and destructive policies that he has initiated, from cutting tens of thousands of employees, of cutting hundreds of millions of dollars in research grants. And most relevant to this discussion has been changes that have been made or will be made on vaccines. And as I say, we can talk about that more later, but this really is a life and death issue. So people need to be informed about it and need to act. So I'd like to start, the next slide is a picture of Louis Pasteur himself as a young man. He was a chemist who initially wanted to work on crystals, which is also something that Pierre Curie was very interested in. And if you go to the next slide, what Pasteur found was that crystals can often be an indicator of the arrangement of atoms on the microscopic level, which could not be seen with the eye. And what he also found was that crystals were generally asymmetrical. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see a diagram of, I think maybe you jumped over one, maybe not. Go to the next one.
All right, I'll try.
There we go. Okay. These are crystals of something called tartaric acid, which can be found in wine bottles, sometimes on the cork. And that he had been invited to investigate why French winemakers were having huge vats of grape juice, which would normally ferment into fine wine, would often go sour and produce either vinegar or something else which had to be thrown out. And in the course of investigating this, he found that these crystals would form in two versions, which we often call left and right-handed versions, because they cannot be superimposed upon one another, much like your two hands. While you can put one hand over the other, but now the front is where the back is on the other hand, so they cannot be made identical. And that occurs in crystals. And he used a polarimeter, which was maybe the prior picture, yeah, in order to actually measure how not only crystals, but solutions of things like sugar or turpentine, things which were the product of living processes, how they could rotate the plane of polarized light, whereas a mixture that had simply been produced in a test tube out of chemicals contained both versions and had no effect on polarized light. And he referred to this as asymmetrical.
Roger, what? Can you repeat that? Repeat the first was produced by what? That polarized the light?
Yeah, well, okay. I didn't really explain this. A plate, the plate here labeled number 3 has a grating on it that would only allow light which was vibrating in a vertical direction to pass through. Mm-hmm. And in the location labeled 5 and 6, you could have a sample of some solution, just like sugar, water, or turpentine. And then at the far end, at labeled 7, you could have another sheet of polarized glass, which also had a grating on it. And if both of those plates were aligned in the same direction, light would normally pass straight through. But if the solution in the middle, in between the two plates, had rotated the plane in which the light was vibrating, that you could measure that by rotating the second polarizing plate labeled number 7. And that a solution that was simply a chemical mixture would have no effect, even if both left and right-handed versions were present, that the net effect would be 0, but that if you took sucrose, for example, or you took a solution of proteins that came from living organisms, that it would rotate the plane of polarized light to the left or to the right, and each substance would have a characteristic degree of rotation. So
That's
he
really
viewed this
fascinating. I want to make sure that sinks in, because what you're saying is that a substance which is a result of a living process has a directionality, or it's a particular type, whereas if it's just if it's only the chemicals, then you get a bunch of symmetrical objects. You don't, one direction doesn't favor the other one.
Right. They may not be symmetrical,
Uh-huh.
but you'll have an equal mixture of both left and right-handed versions. So the net effect cancels out.
Wow.
So he found this very significant, and this very much goes to some of the research that Vernadsky did, talking about how the biosphere is a qualitatively different realm from the abiotic. And there have been many, many papers written trying to explain, why did we wind up with left-handed sucrose? Why is that the only version that seems to be produced? And that this may indicate how life may have come to the Earth. That there are processes in space that might produce one form, one isomer of some of these organic molecules that are constituents of life. So that was sort of his first foray into living processes. And in the course of studying both these crystals and wine, he discovered, if you go to the next slide.
Oops, hold on a second.
Yeah, well, these are the fermentation vats. These are gigantic vats full of grape juice. And that's how they made wine in the 1800s. And no one really knew what fermentation was. That somehow magically, if you stomp on grapes and leave them in a vat, they should turn into wine. And what Pasteur did when he was asked to come in and try to figure out why the wine was going bad, he brought his microscope. And you would, if you're simply looking at a chemical process, you would not expect to be able to see anything with a microscope. The microscope was developed around 1668 by von Leeuwenhoek. And although he had already seen small organisms in pond water, had revealed this whole new microscopic world, it was not really understood or exploited in ways that it could be. And if you go to the next slide, what Pasteur, oh yes, I have to show you this. This is a picture of myself and my wife Denise in Copenhagen at the intersection of Pasteur Street or Pasteur Way and Niels Bohr Avenue. This is right next to the Carlsberg Brewery.
Oh,
and
wow.
They named a street after Pasteur because in addition to his work on wine, he also helped to dramatically improve the shelf life of beer, which could then be shipped all over the world, by understanding the life process that was responsible for fermentation in both cases. And the next slide shows you, oh, we missed one. Should be a picture of yeast. Do we have a picture of yeast?
No.
Oh, I guess we don't. Okay. Well, what Pasteur found with his microscope was these little budding cells of yeast, which other people had known was present, but did not appreciate that the yeast was actually responsible for fermentation. That yeast is an organism that would take in the sugar from grapes or the grains that would be used to make beer and would use it for energy, for its own cellular functions and reproduction. And that it would consume the sugar, and the byproducts would be alcohol and carbon dioxide. So the bubbles in champagne or the nice head on your glass of beer, that's thanks to yeast as well as the alcohol. And he identified that it was a living process that was responsible for producing those wonderful beverages. And that in the case of wine that went sour, he found other organisms that had grown, which were toxic or produced something bitter or sour. And if people know anything about Pasteur, they know the word of pasteurization, which is not only used for milk, but what was developed in wine and beer was that you could briefly heat those liquids to kill off the majority of the organisms that were there, so that then the beer or a wine would keep for weeks, months, for a very long time. And Pasteur is responsible for that. So that was really a chemist who's now moving into the field of biology. And this is one of the really extraordinary things about Pasteur, that he was not defined by a title or a job description, because he recognized that in the same way that we could tackle these diseases, if you want to call it that, of beer or wine, something along those lines, that why couldn't we also investigate how living processes, microbes, are responsible for human disease? And this is the whole idea of germ theory. There were other people who had put this idea forward, but it wasn't understood. A lot of people, they'd use this term miasma, which was, well, it was sort of like a poisonous gas that would somehow infect people and make them sick and die. And it wasn't transmitted from person to person, and it was like bad air. And you are familiar with the idea of bloodletting, where you'd have similar ideas that somehow you could get rid of these bad humors by just cutting somebody's vein open and letting them bleed. So medicine had quite a ways to go. And germ theory was really a crucial concept to be able to approach the study of disease and work to develop ways of combating it. So the next picture.
Oops.
This is a child in Bangladesh with smallpox, and this is just from the 1970s. This is not ancient history. It's estimated that in the 20th century, 300 to 500 million people died of smallpox, particularly children. And this was tackled by a guy named William Jenner. If you go to the next slide, who, I think it was 1768, he did the first inoculation. What he had observed was that milkmaids would often get something called cowpox, and they would get these pustules on their hands. But it was also observed that these milkmaids rarely contracted smallpox, and that somehow the cowpox, which they did contract, provided them with protection against smallpox. And the cases of smallpox were generally fairly mild. And Jenner had the idea
Can
that
I just ask, are those cows popping out of people's arms?
exactly.
Okay.
This is he was English. This is a cartoon that was published by the Anti-Vaccine Society in London, ridiculing his procedure for inoculation, where he would take pus from these pustules on milkmaids' hands who had contracted cowpox and would inject it into healthy volunteers, or in the first case, it was the 8-year-old son of his gardener.
Huh.
So I don't know how voluntary that was, but he injected cowpox pus into the arm of his gardener's son. And I think maybe he got a little fever, but everything basically was very mild. And then a couple weeks later, he injected the same boy with smallpox.
Oh my gosh.
And he was perfectly fine.
Well,
so this became quite a sensation. And he began to inoculate people using cowpox to protect them against smallpox. And this was a big deal. Cotton Mather was a big proponent of inoculation, as was Benjamin Franklin. George Washington actually suffered a fairly severe case of smallpox when he was a boy. And during the American Revolution, he ordered that all new recruits be inoculated with smallpox, because the belief was that if this was done under controlled conditions, under supervision of a doctor, that the death rate was quite low, which otherwise could be devastating. In many wars, the Crimean War and other wars, more people would die of disease than they would from combat. So in the 1700s, this was really the first case of inoculation, which basically means using some naturally weakened microbe to infer protection against the full-blown disease. Now, if you okay, and then what Pasteur did, he was looking at a disease that affected chickens, chicken cholera. And this is a wonderful case of serendipity. And Pasteur had this quote, "Chance favors the prepared mind." That if you're thinking about something, if you studied something, then some event that you hadn't planned on may lead to a real breakthrough. And this happened in chicken cholera, where he had prepared a solution of the cholera microbe that he was using to study its life cycle and how the course of the disease progressed. And he instructed his assistant to discard this sample while Pasteur went on holiday. And the assistant forgot to do that, and he went on holiday too. So when Pasteur returned about a month later, this flask was still sitting there. And rather than saying, oh, that idiot forgot to uh, discard this and throw it out, he said, well, let's see what happens. And what he found that having the microbe sit open to the air, which allowed in oxygen, had artificially weakened the microbe.
Hmm.
So that then when he injected it in the chickens, they were fine.
Huh.
And it gave them protection against the normal strength chicken cholera. And that's the first example of an artificially weakened or attenuated microbe. So now you're getting into the point of actually being able to identify the pathogen, identify the microbe that's causing the disease, and say, okay, how can we weaken it? How can we change it so that it will have the desired effect on the immune system of people who you're trying to protect, and how we can tackle them. And that's what he then set out to do. And if you go to the next slide, this is anthrax, which is a disease of cattle.
Hmm.
And
so is that a bacteria? That's why it says bacillus?
Yeah, I'll just give you a sense of this. Some common bacteria, ones that Pasteur dealt with, were chicken cholera and anthrax.
Mm.
Other bacteria, tuberculosis, diphtheria, staph, strep, E. coli, tetanus, typhoid, meningitis, those are all caused by bacteria, which, as in the case, well, can often be seen under a microscope. They're microscopic but relatively large. There's a whole nother category of viruses, which are much smaller than bacteria, which generally can't be seen. Smallpox, rabies, polio, influenza, those are all viruses. And one thing I should just mention to you that I neglected earlier when I was discussing germ theory, there was a doctor in, I think, Vienna, who was looking at the astounding death rate of women giving birth, particularly in hospitals. In Paris, in the early 1800s, roughly 25% of women died giving birth to children.
Wow.
And that women who gave birth at home with a midwife generally did much better. And when he studied what was going on in the hospitals, he found out that in many cases, doctors would go from autopsies they were doing on the women who had died the day before, and would go directly from the mortuary or the autopsy to deliver babies. And that in fact the doctors were the carrier of the disease that was killing the mothers. And the doctors, so he ordered various sanitation measures, sterile operating rooms, sterile bandages, things like that, which led to a drastic reduction in the mortality of women in the hospitals. And all the doctors jumped up and down. They said, doctors are gentlemen, and gentlemen's hands are clean. So they actively fought against all these measures to sanitize operating rooms. So anyway, that also figures into this whole development of germ theory, what's actually killing people. And in the case of anthrax, this was something where the French government actually asked Pasteur. Again, he's not a medical doctor, he's not even a veterinarian. He was asked to come in and try to understand why there was I think it was something like 10% of cattle and sheep would die of anthrax. And in that case, he found that the anthrax was actually transmitted through spores, that anthrax, which is a bacteria, it could create spores which were next to impossible to kill with chemicals. You could bury a dead, cow for 10 years. And if earthworms brought any of that material back up to the surface 10 years later, it could infect healthy cattle again. And so with every disease, Pasteur found that it required a completely different approach. In the case of chicken cholera, it meant exposing it to oxygen. In the case of anthrax, you had to deliberately grow the bacteria in a culture at a temperature of 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and that allowed you to produce a weakened bacteria without it turning into these spores, which you couldn't kill. So every new disease required a new approach. Some vaccines that would work on one species were completely ineffective on another species. So it was challenging, to say the least. And there was a grand experiment performed regarding anthrax in a village where Pasteur, they set up an experiment. They had 25 cows and sheep who were given a weakened form of anthrax, and another 25 cows and sheep that were left alone. They waited 2 weeks. They came back. The first group that had already gotten the first vaccination got another dose of a more virulent form of the anthrax. And again, the second group was left alone. And then a few weeks later, they came back and they gave all 50 animals a full shot of anthrax. And what happened was that the animals that had been vaccinated by Pasteur in group 1, they all lived. The animals that had not been vaccinated all died.
Wow.
So there was
not that large of a sample, but it's a pretty large fraction of your sample.
Yes, it definitely worked. And Pasteur was invited to go to Hungary and show them these techniques. And again, this made meat and animal products more widely available, more cheaply, and this raised the standard of living and the health of the population in general. He was a big advocate for public health measures. And so at this point, he's clearly on a roll. He's demonstrated that he can both discover the causes and develop techniques for combating major illnesses. And I think the next case was rabies. And this is something he had apparently witnessed. A group of 10 children being attacked by a rabid dog when he was a boy, and almost all of them died. And in general, it was an excruciating death that no one had any treatment for, but it created real terror. If you go to the next slide.
Oops, hold on.
That's the grand experiment. So go to the next.
Okay.
Okay, now this rabies is a virus. And this is an electron micrograph of a bacteria, which is the big round blob, being attacked by viruses. So you get a size comparison. And the range of bacteria and viruses definitely varies. But viruses, because it's debatable whether you should really consider them to be alive or not, because they don't contain a nucleus. They don't contain mitochondria to produce energy. They don't have ribosomes to construct proteins for their own reproduction. All they have is the genetic material, the instruction sheet to produce themselves. So viruses will attack, whether it's a bacteria, a human lung cell, like COVID or some other cell, and take over the internal machinery of the host cell to produce all of the components of the virus. And then as those components assemble and the cell becomes filled with new viruses, the cell will generally rupture, killing the cell and releasing the virus to go on to find new hosts. And rabies was a virus. It could not be seen under a microscope. So now you're adding another level of complexity. How do you fight something that you can't even see? And this was something that, again, took an enormous amount of research. He had to deliberately infect numerous dogs just to determine the life cycle of the rabies virus. They could not find any medium in which to grow the rabies virus. It had to reproduce within a living animal. And he found that by deliberately infecting one rabbit and then using nerve tissue from that rabbit to infect another rabbit, that doing this 90 times, that he was able to produce an even stronger rabies virus, and also to be able to produce a virus of consistent strength and to be able to mass produce it, which obviously, if you're going to develop a vaccine that's going to be used on thousands of animals or people, you have to have a large supply. And then he found that by injecting it into monkeys and repeating this sort of process, he could produce a weakened form of the virus by taking the spinal cord of rabbits and drying them in a sterile environment. And I think the next picture.
You mean the spinal cord of an infected rabbit?
Right.
Okay.
And if you go to the next couple pictures, that's a rabid dog. And if you go to the next one, that when someone or an animal was bitten, it might take weeks or months before they died. And that what they found was that the rabies virus attacked the nervous system and actually traveled up the nervous system until it got to the brain, which produced the violent reaction, delirium, etc. So what Pasteur eventually figured out was that if he dried the spinal cord of an infected rabbit, that after about 14 days, the spinal tissue would have no effect when it was injected into a healthy animal. But one that had been dried for a shorter number of days would affect the animal. So that what he eventually did, he found a way to essentially vaccinate animals to prevent them from contracting rabies. But the real challenge was, what do you do if someone was bitten? Which is what he had experienced. If someone has been bitten, is that a death sentence? Or was there something that you could do after they had been bitten? And if you go to the next slide, this is Joseph Meister. And I forget exactly the year, maybe 1880, somewhere around there. A mother brought her son to Pasteur, who had been bitten by a rabid dog that morning, and begged him to treat her son. Now, Pasteur had volunteered to experiment on himself with a rabies vaccine. He felt he had developed a method that would be effective, but to test it on a human being, he was not a licensed doctor. And potentially he could have been charged with murder if he had tried to vaccinate someone and they had died. So, and I think this goes to Pasteur's character as well, that he was willing to risk his own life for the validation of this important discovery and treatment. His wife and friends talked him out of it, that it would discredit his work if he tried it and died. But in this case with Joseph Meister, he agreed to treat the boy. And what he wound up doing was, over the course of about 10 days, he gave him an injection of dried spinal cord tissue, initially tissue that had been dried for 14 days, then 13 days, 12 days, etc. And each shot meant that the boy was getting a somewhat stronger rabies virus. And the thinking of Pasteur was that because the rabies virus took weeks or months to actually travel to the brain, that these vaccines, these injections, would trigger an immune response in the victim, even after they've been bitten, that would stimulate an immune response that would actually combat the rabies virus before it had progressed and killed them. And that's exactly what happened. Joseph Meister recovered 100%.
Wow, how exciting.
Yes. And this, again, was world news. And there were various people who had been bitten who came to Pasteur for this treatment. There was a young girl who had been bitten 37 days before she came to Pasteur. Wow. And there's this very moving quote from the father that it was basically a hopeless case. And Pasteur knew it, but he agreed to treat her anyway, and she did die. And the father, there's this very moving quote where he says, I've never seen anyone with this character, that even though this could destroy his character for the sake of humanity, he fought to save his daughter.
Mm.
And then there was another famous case, the Newark boys. There were 4 boys in Newark, New Jersey, who were all bitten by a rabid dog. And remember, Pasteur's in Paris.
Wow.
And this became a national campaign. There was a newspaper which reported on this story and carried out a fundraising campaign to get those boys onto a steamship over to Paris. And they showed up, and this was children sending in their pennies, and Andrew Carnegie contributed, and they were able to raise the funds in order to send these boys to Paris.
Hmm.
And I think I have a picture. Yeah, there's a picture. These are the 4 Newark boys, and if you look, you can see many of them are still wearing their bandages.
Is this in Paris now?
Yeah, I think, yeah. This was in Paris.
Wow.
And again, they were all saved.
Wow. How long did the trip take at that time?
It had to have taken 2 or 3 weeks, I think.
Right.
Maybe a little shorter, but it was a big deal, and obviously it cost some money.
Right.
Fortunately, it wasn't the Titanic.
Right.
So that led to a couple traditions. If you go to the next slide, we have a picture of the Pasteur Institute.
Oh, wait, there's the boys.
Oh, yeah, that's late 1885.
Wow. So did they come back to Newark after this?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, we should find their grandchildren. All right. Here we go. What a story. Okay.
So this is the Pasteur Institute. So Pasteur had become, a national hero at this point, although it's astounding. He was attacked throughout his life. Mm-hmm. I showed you the picture of Jenner, but there were anti-vax societies created in Paris and elsewhere that would hold public meetings denouncing Pasteur as a charlatan, that he didn't cure rabies, he gave them rabies, and that he was just a complete fraud and has always been throughout his entire life. And it was really quite remarkable the kind of resistance he got, in part because, he was a chemist, right? He wasn't a biologist. He wasn't a medical doctor. Who the hell is this guy telling us we should wash our hands? We should do this and that to fight disease. What does he know? Mm. But given the extraordinary victories that he had won, and also discovered, the microbe responsible for diphtheria and staph and strep and all of these things, that an institute was constructed in his name. And not only did Americans contribute to the Pasteur Institute, which initially was set up basically for the treatment of rabies. That was sort of the initial work that they did, that thousands of people wound up being treated over the course of years. But there was a real collaboration between American doctors and the Pasteur Institute, doctors who came to Paris on fellowships to be trained under the leadership of Pasteur and his students. And he always he insisted that any of the awards that he received or the acclaim that he received, that his younger assistants share equally in those accolades, because they were such an important part of it. And I'll just end this part with a couple quotes. On his 70th birthday in 1892, at the Sorbonne, there was a huge assembly. Russia's Alexander III was president. Sadi Carnot, who was president of the French Republic, was there. And Joseph Lister, who I didn't mention, who was also a critical figure in developing these techniques for sterilizing instruments, operating theaters, etc. He was there. And this is a quote from Pasteur. He said, "You delegates of foreign countries who have come a long way to show your sympathy for France have given me the greatest joy a man can feel who believes that science and peace will prevail over ignorance and war, that the nations will learn to understand each other, not for destruction, but for advancement, and that the future belongs to those who have done most for suffering mankind." And then at this same birthday celebration, he called on the younger generation. He said, "Young men, live in the serene peace of the laboratories and libraries. Ask yourselves first, what have I done for my education? And as you gradually advance, what have I done for my country? Until the moment comes when you experience the tremendous gratification of knowing that in some measure you have contributed to the progress and welfare of mankind. More or less favored by the current of life as your efforts may be, you must have the right to say, on approaching the great goal, I have done all I could do."
Mm.
So that's, I often think, why do people put up with, what they have to put up with? Why would someone like Pasteur, I mean, he had like 3 strokes, I think, because he was definitely overworked, and he's constantly being attacked by all these leading figures in the medical community and elsewhere. Why put up with it? What's the sense of identity, of character? And clearly he had this conception of the immortality of the soul, and that what gave his life meaning was the contribution that he could make to present and future generations. So he's a wonderful example. By the way, he refused to patent anything. He said these discoveries, these belong to all of mankind. The idea that someone would profit from finding a cure or a vaccine to prevent disease, it's an obscene idea. So he refused to do any of that. It belonged to mankind.
Wow. Yeah, that's such a change. And I think one of the questions you ask, you say, well, is there a way to foster that kind of commitment and dedication in a new generation? Because I think one of the shifts that occurred, which Lynn always talked about, the shift from being a producer to a consumer, is suddenly the standard is only what the guy with the most money can make you think everybody else wants. Right. But whether it works or not, or does any good or not, that's, we don't worry about that. It's all right in the making of money. And frankly, if you work hard, if you have to work hard, you must be dumb. You're you probably have more of a recollection of this blue collar shift where everyone decided that was bad and unsightly. Better to have a white collar and figure out how to rip people off.
That's right. That's right. If you're smart, you won't have to work, period.
Right. And we have that today, the people who work the very hardest, like home health aides, and I mean, really back-breaking work that requires a lot of thought and care, and they get paid almost nothing. And people who sit around snorting cocaine and doing day trading get a lot of money and are respected for it.
Well, that brings me to Robert Kennedy Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want to talk about this a little bit because we're entering an extremely dangerous period where this whole idea of the role of vaccination, of the role of medicine in general, is being really warped. And it's not coincidental that if you look at some of the personnel changes, Kennedy, he fired every single member of the advisory committee on immunization practice. 17 members, he fired all of them, replaced them with people, some of whom have no medical background, who are so-called vaccine skeptics. And you can be skeptical of various things. One of the purposes of this advisory committee is to address questions like that. Should we give, 3 vaccines in the same shot? This is one of the things that's been raised. Should you spread them out? And to a degree that can be legitimate basis of discussion.
May I just say a couple of the people he brought in, because I think this will, were you going to get to that? I just think it's so, so one of the new leaders who's been put on the, what is it called, Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices,
right,
is a guy named Retsef Levi, Levi. He's an Israeli who served 12 years on the Israeli Defense Forces as an officer in the intelligence wing, and was designated as an extra merit officer. He works at the Sloan School of Management and Operations Research. I mean, how on earth does that qualify you? And then this other guy, Jim O'Neill.
This guy has no medical background whatsoever.
Right, or science, or chemistry, or biology, or something, right? No. And frankly, if he's IDF intelligence, I'm not sure he really cares about the welfare of human beings, which would be the first requisite. And then this Jim O'Neill character, who's a
the acting director of the CDC now.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, Kennedy fired the head of the CDC, and this guy O'Neill is the acting director.
A Peter Thiel follower, I have to say. So for people who don't like every bit of your personal data being micromanaged and shared, and all of the really nasty things that are coming through this AI accelerationist, whatever. Go ahead. I'm sorry, but I just find this so outrageous, really outrageous.
No, it is. And these are the people who are making decisions on whether your children will be vaccinated. And I think one of the most alarming indications of where this is heading is if you look at Florida, the Surgeon General of Florida, who is himself a Black American, has compared vaccines to slavery. He has said the COVID vaccine is unsafe, is unfit for human consumption, and is pushing for the elimination of all mandatory vaccines. Now, there's legal, there may have to be legislation passed. There certainly would be legal challenges. But he is arguing, and this has been endorsed by the governor, Ron DeSantis, that all mandated viruses be eliminated, meaning it is entirely up to the parents to decide when and if their children get any vaccinations. And the immediate effect of this is whether they succeed in eliminating the mandates. It's extremely confusing. You're going to have every state, county, locality coming out with different policies, that you're going to have parents who are already strapped for money and time. It's not clear who's going to pay for vaccines if they're not being recommended. In rural areas, people often have to travel an hour or two to a doctor or a clinic. And people may simply say, I can't keep track of this stuff. There's no mandate, there's no schedule. And besides, I don't know anybody who has measles. I don't know anybody who has polio. They probably won't get it anyway. And then you look at Texas, where in the year 2000, measles was declared eliminated in the United States. It still existed. It was still out there. But because virtually everyone was being vaccinated from measles, there were no active cases. In Texas, and I don't know sort of the history of I think it was probably through these exemptions that they allow, where for specific religious or personal belief reasons, you can get an exemption from having your kids vaccinated. And so the vaccination rate had dropped in Texas to about 92 or 93%. And in some material I read, they estimate that to have herd immunity, where basically no one contracts the disease, you need a vaccination rate of about 95%. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, as I just said, for the last 25 years, nobody's had measles. So you can see how a parent, for whatever reasons, if they don't trust the government or they've heard that vaccines cause autism or something like that, they saw something on the internet, that for whatever reason, people began to get exemptions, did not have their children vaccinated. And in Texas, there have been over 1,000 cases of measles, virtually every one of which is from someone who was not vaccinated. So the vaccines do work and are safe. And 3 people died, 2 of them being children. And so if you start eliminating and this is for children going to school, which is largely how it's enforced. Your children can't go into a public school unless they can be certified as having been vaccinated. And this very much goes to the whole idea of the general welfare. That you could easily make an argument in Texas, say a year ago, well, nobody's getting measles. Why should I have my child vaccinated? Maybe there's a risk, 1 in a billion chance that they'll get sick from the vaccine, but nobody has measles. But if you don't give a damn about the general welfare, about your neighbors and people you've never met, and you take this approach of, well, I'll do whatever I want, it's my body, I'll do whatever I want, that leads to outbreaks. And in Florida, they're calling it's a fight for medical freedom. Right. That the government doesn't have the right to tell you what to inject into your body or into your children. And so I could see this going bad. It might take a couple years, right? The vaccination rates have to drop a certain amount before you get outbreaks. But we easily could see measles, polio, other things making a comeback that we had virtually eliminated.
Right. Well, I don't think the government, frankly, has been helped by its own practices, because the claims that they care about health or not, or this is about health, are sort of belied by the shutdown of hospitals everywhere.
Yep.
And particularly maternity wards. So if you're concerned about the collapse of population, well, if you have nowhere to deliver a baby safely, that's not good. And also, again, I do have to say on the COVID question, the way that this was handled did not foster a great deal of trust, especially when you learn that people like Ursula von der Leyen made, I forget how much, $800 €100,000 or I don't know how, or millions and millions of dollars on stock in Pfizer, right? Unlike what Pasteur said, which is if you're doing something for the general welfare, you don't want to, you want everyone to do well, to live well, to be healthy. And so people have concerns about things like obesity, diabetes, all of this, but then they lack, I mean, just what you went through with Pasteur, I think is so wonderful because nobody did programs, for example, during the pandemic about the question of scientific method. How is this developed? Why does it work? When FDR ran the Tennessee Valley Authority, was very interesting. And I know in a pandemic, you can't do things in that way. But Lilienthal asked people to be volunteer demonstration farmers and said, will you try out this nitrate fertilizer? And then people saw that the alfalfa in the fertilized farms was 3 feet tall, bright green, beautiful. The people who didn't do it was wasted, shriveled up, dead. And then the next thing you knew, everybody said, I want this, I want to fertilize my farm.
Right.
So we have a problem where people legitimately are upset about being stampeded under threat of terror. You're an evil person if you don't conform. And watching the fact that the government really doesn't seem to give a damn. There were lawsuits in New York with the NYCHA, the public housing buildings, where you had enormous COVID death rates, very high, because they were poor. And also a ventilation company testified that the air ventilation system went through bathrooms and kitchens indiscriminately. And they had a contract to put new ventilation systems in these buildings, and they never were allowed to do it. And you say, how can why should we trust you? You're not even interested in whether people get clean air or whatever else is being spread through rat feces and this and that. I think it's a very serious crisis, actually. I mean, unless you're going to say, look, the general welfare is the number one principle, and we are going to defend that. And you can look at things like life expectancy, like you showed. Obviously, the fact that people are vaccinated against measles, mumps, rubella, polio, all these things has been a reason why people are living to 100 years now. But no one seems to want that anymore, right? I mean, Ezekiel Emanuel said that no one should have a prostate screening after the age of 65.
Right. Yeah, no, it's clearly a broader question than just vaccines. And, childhood obesity is a problem. I mean, if we want to eliminate artificial food dyes and things like that, that might be beneficial. But when you're cutting hundreds of millions of dollars in medical research, and then you look at Trump tried to cut billions of federal dollars to universities he didn't like Harvard and Columbia. That's medical research into cancer research. And when you disrupt research programs, you can't just turn it back on again. It's not a vacuum cleaner or a blender. You just turn it back on again. That the research is lost. You have to start all over again. And so when you combine that with things like cuts to NASA, cuts to all sorts of fundamental scientific research, that you clearly get this sense that, hey, there's just not enough for everybody. And the poor people are just on their own. They're going to have to go. And
right.
The people in Silicon Valley who, they'll use gene editing to produce perfect blue-eyed, blonde-haired babies that'll live on Mars.
If they can figure out how to get them there without NASA, I don't know. But that brings up this whole eugenic thing, because remember that book, The Bell Curve, right? Where you want to say, and it wasn't that being less intelligent was genetic, their thesis was, I won't say hypothesis, because frankly with them is an axiom really, which is if you're not rich, if you didn't figure out how to get rich, you must be stupid. And if you're stupid, you're inferior. So if you get a lot of diseases and if you die young, well, that's just as well because you were inferior, and we should really only have the survival of the fittest, which is a complete not lack of understanding of the nature of what it means to be a human being, as opposed to being a lion or something. And in the world of lions, the strongest, fastest runner probably survives, but it's unlikely that that lion is going to write a Beethoven symphony or discover fusion or the things that would transform life for all the lions that come afterwards.
Yeah, no, it's very disturbing. You know, from my perspective, Pasteur is a great subject for study, both because to try to understand how he thought, because our interest in this is to promote new geniuses. Where
Right.
the next discovery is going to come from, whether it's in medicine or anything else. And how do you produce genius? How do you relive great discoveries to help stimulate those same mental processes in yourself or in other people? And this aspect of his character, you know, this is what we should all aspire to be and to do with our lives. If more people thought that way and not just about money, you know, we would be doing a lot better.
Yes, and our money would actually be worth more on top of it. Let me just say, it's not that we don't want people to have money. We want people to do well and prosper. So I would like to thank you very much for joining. Is there anything you want to say in conclusion?
No, I think I've said it all. Just find great minds to study and work to emulate. That's a great goal for everyone.
Thank you. I agree very much. And for people watching, there's lots of activities this week because of the UN General Assembly. And I can say that tomorrow, which is Saturday, the 27th, there will be a rally in Kingston, New York, which will include Judge Napolitano, Congressman Dennis Kucinich, Scott Ritter, and others, sponsored by the Peace and Freedom Coalition and Gerald Celente up there. And I think there's plans of some LaRouche organizers to have a table there. So it's at 2 p.m. at the Four Corners. So if you're in the New York area, go to Kingston, New York. And otherwise, thanks for listening. One other thing is that the New York City Schiller Institute NYC Chorus has begun its new season. And so if you're near New York City, Thursday nights, that's right. Roger is the pillar of our bass section. So if you want to sing, which is very good for your health, then you should come Thursday nights over near Lincoln Center, and you can go to SINYC Chorus, SINYCCHORUS.com to sign up, and someone will contact you with the details for the rehearsals. So have a lovely time. We have a lot of work to do. Good night.
Thank you.